Here we have a classical rook ending, and of course in such endings it's useful to know some endgame theory or some typical patterns in order to facilitate the calculation process. And well, what we can see at the first glance is that black has a very easy threat. I mean, black is first of all a pawn up, but if white doesn't do anything, then black threats to give a check on g1 and promotes, and the game is over. So that leads us to the first candidate move of rook b8. The other alternative of rook b8 is only to give the check on d8. All other moves we can actually rule out immediately, because if the king moves, for example, to f2, then rook f1, check is finishing the game in the easiest manner. So what is the difference between rook b8 and rook d8? Both moves look actually, let's say, appealing. Rook b8 for the fact that actually I prevent rook g1 check and promotion. And rook d8 looks appealing because, okay, after rook d8, if the king tries to get closer, then actually black will not improve the position, because now there is no issue. We can simply wait, and we can always wait. For example, not with such moves. With king f2 we have to be careful because of rook h1. Not this way, but we can wait just this way, and well, if the king approaches, we do the same stuff. So there is no way of black to improve. So that makes rook d8 check appealing. But okay, king e3 by intuition maybe looks not so great for white, because then the pawn is slowly under attack. And actually this might be the reason why your intuition doesn't like the move rook d8. But as a small warning in endings, forget about your intuition, because in my opinion, intuition doesn't exist in endgames. The less material, the more actually we have the problem about having a forced character. So endgames are quite concrete. And the first question we should ask ourselves is actually, and this is difficult, when we have an ending with little material on the board, then always the question should arise, how is the resulting pawn ending? This is very important, because this actually is helping you to choose. If you choose to move rook b8, you should know how the ending, the pawn ending will be for you, because black has the option of rook c1, rook d1 and rook e1 to get yourself in a pawn ending, and you will not be able to prevent it. Let's say I start with rook e1. If you take and I give a check, then you should understand how this ending is. And actually here some rules and some endgame patterns, motives may help you actually to already understand how the result is here. If you don't, of course, know it, then you have to calculate everything, and this is much harder. But in the game actually, and this was a game between Inakiev and Karyakin, so two very strong Russian grandmasters, the blunder rook b8 was played, and now we have to choose between rook c1, rook d1, rook e1. To your funny surprise, even two winning moves are available, but here we should know the basics of the pawn endings. And in the pawn endings there's a basic rule: the one who leaves the opposition first is usually the one who has a problem. That's my personal rule, but it helps. And this means already that rook e1 and rook c1 should be the right moves, because after rook d1, if you take and I give a check, then after capture, I'm the one to win the opposition by the move king h2. King f2 we will first of all check, but king h2 is here the move to win the long distance opposition. But this is important, because king f2 has a problem that after king d3 you cannot play king f3, and you need king h3 to hold the opposition, and this is the reason why king f2 would lose a game. But king h2 here, if you know some basics of pawn endings, is enough to understand that this is a draw, because you just correspond to the corresponding squares. If your opponent goes to e3, you go to g3. If he goes to e2, you go to g2. If he goes to e1, you go to g1, and he can't improve because he doesn't even have any spare tempi. If he goes to d1, you go to h1, and so on and so forth. If he goes to c2, you go to g2, because you should be ready again to correspond to the corresponding squares d3 with h3, d2 with h2, and d1 with h1. Okay, so far so good. Let's get back to the position after rook b8. Of course, like Kayakin and also Inakiev, I'm not sure what actually like Inakiev missed. Maybe he was in time trouble. But he played rook b8, and after rook e1 the game was lost, because if you take, then I give a check. And here, just the rule, we win the opposition, and there's no chance, because the problem is that after king g3 I can sneak from behind. You may play king h3, but then after king f2 the pawn is gone. And if you play f4, I do nothing but to wait with king e2. You may take, or you may play f5. It doesn't really matter, because you cannot hold the e4 pawn, and this is just for you losing the game. The funny part is why I said there are two moves winning, that after rook b8 even rook c1 wins, because after rook takes b2, rook c2 check, we still win the opposition. However, the long distance opposition, but opposition is opposition. There's a closed one, there's a long distance one. All you need to know is that an opposition by definition is a kind of, well, king side view, or look at each other either on the diagonal, in the row, or in the file. And important is that there's always an uneven number of squares between both kings. So that's why this is a long opposition. Also the king on a2 would be an opposition. It would be the longest opposition, but king c2 is enough, because now it's very simple. If king f1, then king d1, and we win in the same style. King g3 is interesting, because that move is the only move where I try to trick you. But here the problem is you cannot guard the square h1, so I win with king d1. And here, well, if king g2, then king e2. If king f2, then I win this way. And eventually I get to the same story which we have seen in the game. So that's why also after rook b8 the move rook c1 would win the game, but it's more sophisticated and there's no need to make such jokes in the game. So why does rook d8 make a difference? The story is actually quite easy to tell. I mean, if king c1, king c2, king c3, or king c4, then I can give endless checks. So if king e2, then the problem is I don't have the exchange on the second rank anymore. I can go back to where I was, and black will not improve. So king e3 is the only option. Now again, I have only the move rook b8, and the difference is here that if you play somewhere with if you play rook d1, then actually I make a draw, because after the capture I win the long distance opposition. We have seen it. And if you play rook e1, which is the only chance to win the opposition in the right way, or exchange the rook in the right way, then I have a kind of Zwischenzug, which is the check on b3. And that is the crucial key move which saves the game. For example, king f4 and rook takes b2. And here, even if you attack the pawn, I can protect it. And objectively speaking, black is still better, but black will not win the game, because also f6 is weak and white saves. Anyway, quite interesting and quite sophisticated. And here, of course, when you have to decide between rook b8 and rook d8, knowledge helps. And that's why it's, of course, good when you choose in the right way and find the right decision at the board. But it's even better if you have the basics of pattern recognition. And with pattern recognition, I mean, well, pattern recognition about, let's say, the opposition rule. This is also a kind of pattern recognition, or mating patterns, or perpetual patterns. All these kind of patterns we have seen. The more you know, the easier it is eventually to take the right decision.